Now we get into, I think, our final somatic sense, which is vision, and involves the eye. So we have these different structures here that protect the eye. Of course, there's eyebrows, eyelids, that's fine. Conjunctiva is this membrane that you see covering the eye. It's transparent. It produces a lubricating secretion. You have a lacrimal apparatus, which you'll see on another slide. That's your tear factory. And then we have all these muscles connected to the outside of the eye, and those are called extrinsic eye muscles that we're going to have to go through as well. You have 6 extrinsic eye muscles listed right here. 4 rectus muscle. Rectus means straight. So let's look at the 4 rectus muscles. A superior rectus, right? You got a lateral rectus, which we see here as well. You got a medial rectus on the other side, and then on the underside you have an inferior rectus. Then there's 2 oblique muscles that come in at an angle. This muscle right here that kind of goes through this little pulley. A pulley is called a trochlea. Right, so there's your superior oblique muscle, and then you see this one coming in at an angle on the bottom. That would be your inferior oblique muscle. So there's your 6 extrinsic eye muscles that you need to know. The 4 rectus muscles and the 2 oblique muscles. Very important chart here for lecture and for lab. We need to know the action of each of the 6 muscles. Well, the lateral rectus moves the eye laterally. You can call that abduction if you like. Medial rectus moves the eye medially. That would be called adduction if you'd like. Superior and inferior rectus both have a medial component, but the superior rectus elevates the eye and turns it medially. Inferior depresses the eye and turns it medially. The inferior obliques, just think of, and superior oblique muscles, opposite of superior and inferior rectus. Watch this. Superior rectus elevates and turns medially, while superior oblique depresses and turns laterally. See how the 2 superiors are opposites of each other? Same with the 2 inferiors. Inferior rectus depresses, turns medially. Inferior oblique elevates, turns laterally. Right, so there's the actions that you should know for the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. Now we know, when we covered cranial nerves, is that 3 of our cranial nerves control eye movements. So 3 nerves work on 6 muscles, and you can see which one has the most work. That's cranial nerve 3, ocular motor nerve. So we should know which muscles, extrinsic eye muscles, are controlled by the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3. But an easier way to do it, let's learn the other 2, which means all the rest of them are ocular motor. So we have a cranial nerve that we learned in the previous chapter called abducens, cranial nerve 6. Abducens, we'll just think abduct. Which muscle of the eye abducts it? Remember, laterally, another way to say it is abduction. So that's all the lateral rectus does, moves the eye laterally or abducts it. There's your abducens nerve control for the lateral rectus. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, and remember, a pulley is called a trochlea, this little loop that this muscle tendon goes through. So which muscle uses that little trochlea? Well, that's the superior oblique muscle. So superior oblique muscle is controlled by the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, named after the little loop that this muscle uses. So yeah, lecture, lab, good to know 6 extrinsic eye muscles, their actions, and which cranial nerves control them. All right, our lacrimal apparatus is our tear factory, and tears are produced in the lacrimal gland, which is located superior lateral portion of the orbit, and the lacrimal secretions, which are the tears, will empty out of these ducts from the lacrimal gland over the eye, or the conjunctiva, right, of the eye, and then these tears will flow towards this toward the medial portion of the eye, and then enter these little canals, which are called lacrimal canaliculi. Heard that word before when we did bone. And from there it will flow into this nasolacrimal duct. There's a nasolacrimal sac up here for some overflow, but the nasolacrimal duct will drain the tears into the nasal cavity. So this is happening constantly to flush the eye of debris. The eyeball has 3 layers, outer, middle, and inner. but we'll call them fibrous, vascular, and inner. We're going to go through each of the three layers on the upcoming slides. The inside cavity inside the eyeball is filled with fluid. Those different fluids are called humors. And your lens inside your eye is going to separate that internal cavity into two segments, anterior-posterior segment, which we'll see a little later on, also called anterior and posterior cavities. Let's start with the outermost layer, the fibrous layer. Fibrous means hard or tough, which it is. And the majority of your fibrous layer is the white part of your eye. The white of your eye is called the sclera. It's hard. Sclera also means hard, just like fibrous. And then the sclera at the anterior portion of the eye is transparent, see-through. Well, that region, that area of the fibrous layer that's transparent and it domes out some right from the sclera, that's called the cornea. So the cornea is the transparent 1/6 of the eye, but the entire, rest of the fibrous layer is the sclera. Now we get to the middle layer, which we call the vascular layer of the eye, also called the uvea. The uvea you can see here, so some's peeled away. There's the fibrous outer layer, the sclera. This vascular layer is the vascular layer because that's where the blood vessels are located. And you can see that red layer going all the way around the eye. There's your uvea, or there's your vascular layer. It's made up of two kind of subregions. The choroid region is all the blood vessels, right? As you see in red here, the blood vessels throughout the eye is the choroid, or choroid layer, or choroid region. But then once we get to the anterior portion, we have different structures here. So it splits into two red areas. Well, this little red area here and down here, which is actually all the way around the lens, but this is a cross section, so you can just see the top and the bottom of it. That's called the ciliary body. And the ciliary bodies are actually muscles, often called ciliary muscles or ciliary bodies. And that muscle is holding the lens through these little ligaments, which we call suspensory ligaments, or a ciliary zonule. You see the lens suspended in these ligaments. So this muscle can cause these ligaments to pull on the lens, to flatten it, or to kind of release or relax the suspensory ligaments to bulge the lens. So the lens can change shape. It can flatten or it can bulge depending on how these muscles, these ciliary bodies, are working. And then we also see this part of the vascular layer. The red splits into two, where the anterior portion here is a muscle, and that's the iris. And we'll see the iris on another slide. We'll look at the picture of the iris in a second, but the iris is the colored part of the eye. It's your only pigmented muscle in your whole body. It's part of your eye that's brown or blue or gray or green, whatever color your eyes are. And it's a muscle that regulates the amount of light that enters the eye. And light enters through the center of the iris, which is a hole. The hole is called the pupil, which is in the center of the iris. So for close vision and bright light, the pupils will constrict. For distant vision or dim light, the pupils dilate. So there's how the iris controls the size of the pupil that regulates the amount of light entering the eye, which we'll see illustrated on the next slide. So here we can see some muscles of the iris contracting to make the pupil smaller, therefore allowing less light inside the eye. Here we see the iris is actually pigmented, right? There's the muscle, but with a pigment on top of it. And then here we see other muscles of the iris contracting in order to make the pupil or hole larger to allow more light in. Well, one process is parasympathetic, the other sympathetic. We're not there yet. That's next chapter. So for now, just know what the iris is. Now we're at the inner layer of the eye, which is the retina, which you see in yellow. So that inner lining, it's a very delicate layer, very thin layer, which is the retina. And if we kind of just zoom in the retina, we're looking at cells here. So there's just 3 layers of cells, which is how skinny, right, the retina is, or how thin it is. It says, it has pigmented and neural layer. Well, we have these pigment cells just on the outside, so when light comes in, It doesn't scatter. These cells will absorb that light because they're pigmented. But the most important cells in the retina, all along the retina here, are these cells, which are your photoreceptors. They're rods and they're cones. Those are your two types of photoreceptors for different types of vision, and we'll see these separately on a different slide to explain them better. But there's your photoreceptors that are sensitive to light. There's other cells that we call bipolar and ganglion cells that just are in a series, one synapses with another. Well, all billions of these, quarter billions of these photoreceptors, rods and cones, there's all the axons to them, right? And all the axons come together to make up the optic nerve, which will exit the eye, and we'll see that on the next slide. So here we're looking at the retina a little closer right here. There you see the photoreceptors, all the rods and cones and other cells. But look at this yellow area. These are all the axons of all these millions and millions of photoreceptors that make up this one huge wire, right, made up of all these tiny little wires or axons. So there's your optic nerve. Now, if you look at the photoreceptors, they're continuous, but all of a sudden there's a gap between photoreceptors right here and right here. That's because we need a space for the optic nerve to leave the eyeball. So in this one section of your retina, there are no photoreceptors. If there's no photoreceptors there, that means you don't have vision right there in that spot. We call that spot the optic disc, and it's your blind spot. It's where the optic nerve leaves the eye. So everyone has a little blind spot in each of their eyes, but your other eye will account for the blind spot in the other eye. So that's why we don't realize we have a blind spot. But you can Google it if you like. There's little tests for you to find your blind spot. We all have one in each eye because of this optic disc. Here's the difference between our two photoreceptors of the retina, the rods and the cones. The rods are there for dim light vision. They do not see color. So if you kind of wake up in the middle of the night, you can sort of see around, right? But really you just see shadows and shades of gray. If you were to look in your sock drawer, you wouldn't be able to tell which socks are which color, for example. If there's not enough light, even though you can still see them, that's because under dim light conditions, your rods are functioning and they do not see color, just shades of gray. And we have more of them at our periphery, meaning at the sides of our eyes, meaning if you look at something in dim light straight on, you don't see it as well if you look through your peripheral vision, because our rods are, or at least more of them, are located at the periphery. Now the cones are regular bright light and color vision receptors. There's a spot which we'll see in a second called the macula lutea that's almost straight on when you're looking at something, and that's the area that has almost all cones, mostly cones. So we have a high concentration of cones at this one spot, which is our sharpest vision. But in the center of the macula lutea, we have something called a fovea centralis, a little pit that's all cones, not mostly cones, but all cones, and that's where our best color bright light vision is located. So they're kind of opposite. Rods are in greater numbers at the periphery, but as we move towards the center, we have more cones, specifically in the macula lutea, and even more so, the most cones are in the fovea centralis because there's no rods at all in that location. We're going to look at the anterior and posterior cavities of the eye in a picture in a couple slides from now, so I'll explain this slide when I get to that picture. One of the segments or cavities is broken up into two chambers, anterior and posterior, and filled with fluid called humors. So I'm going to explain this on the next slide as well, and what glaucoma is on that slide. So quite a few things to explain on the picture, which is on the next slide. All right, there's a lot to go through on this picture. We're going to start with something I didn't explain a little earlier. Well, I did explain a little earlier, but you didn't see a picture of it. And that there's on the retina, which you see in yellow, the rods, which are the dim light, non-color seeing photoreceptors, are located at the periphery, so at the sides. That's where we have most of our rods, photoreceptors located. But as we go further central, meaning when you're looking at something straight on, right, light is hitting sort of the center part of the retina. There's where we see more cones and less rods. So the further central we get, the more cones, which are bright light color receptors. The most cones, or this area right here, which is almost straight on, right? If you're looking at something straight on, this is your macula lutea. There it is, macula lutea. That area is mostly all cones, very few rods in there. But right in the center of the macula lutea, there's a little pit called the fovea centralis. That is where there's all cones and no rods. So there's your area of highest visual acuity. So starting at the fovea centralis, working your way towards the periphery, we have more cones, less cones, and opposite, starting at the periphery, working your way to the fovea centralis, you have more rods, and then less rods, and then no rods right in that fovea centralis. All right, next part to go over are the two segments or cavities. So your lens, right here, your lens divides the inside of your eye into an anterior cavity or segment and a posterior cavity or segment. The anterior cavity is filled with a watery fluid called aqueous humor. Humor means fluid, where the posterior cavity, the larger cavity, is filled with a more gel-like fluid called vitreous body or vitreous fluid. And remember, these are called cavities or segments. So posterior cavity or segment filled with vitreous body, anterior cavity or segment filled with aqueous humor. All right. Then we have our anterior cavity or anterior segment is divided into two chambers. Now the iris, which is the pigmented part of the eye with the pupil, the hole in between it, in the center of it I should say, the iris divides the anterior cavity or segment into two chambers. You have a posterior chamber between the lens and the iris. So there's your posterior chamber. And then you have an anterior chamber between the iris and the cornea. So fluid is produced through the blood vessels. Remember, the red is the vascular layer, the choroid layer. Well, fluid will come out of there, right, and fill up aqueous humor, fill up the posterior chamber. It'll go through the pupil into the anterior chamber and then drain through this little canal, sclerovenous sinus. Sometimes it's called the canal of Schlemm. And that's kind of how fluid, aqueous humor, gets cycled through that anterior segment, which is made up of two chambers, posterior and anterior chamber. Now, if this canal is blocked, that means fluid is entering without leaving, and the pressure will build inside the eye. That's called glaucoma. So glaucoma is an increased intraocular pressure, which could be dangerous. So the lens, we'll see more of it in the upcoming slides. The lens is transparent, which means light goes through the lens, just like it goes through the cornea. Light can go through the lens, but the thing with the lens, it can change shape to focus. So lens will bulge or become fatter to focus on something closer, and flatten or become skinnier, right, to focus on something farther. It's made of protein. If the lens starts clouding over or protein starts denaturing, well, then it's harder for light to get through, which was once transparent and now becoming less transparent. And that's what a cataract is a cloudiness of the lens.